Welcome to this session of the 2023 Fuller Missiology Lectures on Evangelism. Our topic for today is evangelism with young people. And we have two of our finest flown in all the way from Altadena, next town over. Kara and Steve, welcome. And could you do a quick introduction for our audience?
Sure, I can go ahead and go first.
Go ahead.
I'm Kara Powell, and I'm a faculty member here at Fuller. My main jobs, though, are I'm the Chief of Leadership Formation, so I oversee all of Fuller's non-degree training. And then I'm the Executive Director of the Fuller Youth Institute, and I'm also overseeing the 10 by 10 collaboration, which is a new discipleship collaborative, very exciting here across the U.S. But maybe the most important thing is I am a mom of a 22-year-old, a 20-year-old, and a 17-year-old. So we are very much living youth and young adult ministry in the Powell family and loving it. So
That's right. We have lots of conversations about that, don't we?
all the time.
All the time.
And Steve, your kids are a little bit older than mine,
That's
so
right.
I love learning
Of
from
course,
you
you're
and
saying
Jen.
that because you're saying I'm older than you.
Yeah, well, you are. You are a little older than me.
And I'm Steve Argue. I'm the Associate Professor of Youth, Family, and Culture here at Fuller. I'm also the Applied Research Strategist at the Fuller Youth Institute, working closely with Kara and our team. I get a chance to teach youth ministry. I run our Doctor of Ministry, Youth, Family, and Culture cohort as well. And a lot of my work is in emerging adulthood and those that are in their 20s, which is a pretty big topic in church world these days. I am also, as Kara said, a father of 3 daughters and a son-in-law, and in their 20s, and love being their dad.
Well, thank you both. So I'm actually relatively new to Fuller, and I've been here now for 2.5 years. And what I knew about Fuller, actually one of the first places was actually through Fuller Youth Institute. And a lot of that was because Fuller Youth Institute was doing good work out in the community, out in the churches, out in the neighborhoods. So what I saw was not just kind of thinking about and maybe researching the topic, but actually going into the churches and into the communities and applying the word. So that's where I want our conversation to go to some extent, to say evangelism is not just a philosophical, theological idea, but how does it really hit the ground? How does it really, and I'm sure those who are tuning in are really concerned about how are we doing evangelism with young people? What does that actually begin to look like? So let's begin with a background on this. Kara, how would you describe young people today? And maybe even define that a little sharply for us. So what does it mean when we say young people? And what are their most pressing questions?
Yeah. So why don't we say young people 13 to 29? Does that work? Okay,
Yeah.
Sounds
great.
good. So all of us have kids in that age.
Yeah,
Right.
you have 2
20-year-old.
kids
That's right.
also, right?
That's
Yeah, absolutely. So we are living it.
We are.
can do a whole other
We could do it.
session
That's
on
right.
that.
Stay tuned.
Later on,
Stay
we'll
tuned.
Mistakes we've made.
Yeah,
on the
lots of
parenting
those.
Journey.
That's right.
So let's say 13 to 29-year-olds. And Soong-Chan, I'm glad you've picked up what's really important to us at the Fuller Youth Institute, which is turning research into resources. So we don't want to just learn. We want to turn what we learn into something practical to help leaders, parents, guardians, grandparents. So you asked about what young people are asking these days. And we just so happen to have our latest book focus on that topic. 3 big questions that change every teenager, which I co-authored with Brad Griffin. And we did deep dive interviews with 27 very diverse teenagers, ethnically and culturally diverse teenagers from across the U.S., and then paired that with a broader sampling of a couple thousand young people to try to understand just what you asked. In the midst of a young person's daily questions, what are they going to do on Friday night? What should they post on social media? What college are they going to, et cetera? What are the deeper questions beneath the questions? And so from spending time with actual young people, we landed on 3. First is the question of identity, or who am I? Second is the question of belonging, or where do I fit? And third is the question of purpose, what difference can I make? So identity, belonging, and purpose. And let me just say, these aren't just young people questions, these are people questions. That, even I and my older friend Steve
That's
Argue,
right here, still asking those questions.
Yeah, we do ask those
Absolutely.
questions like every day, honestly.
Right.
But what we would say out of our research, and this is where it's been so helpful to learn from our school of psychology and marriage and family therapy colleagues, as well as our school of mission and theology colleagues, where the 3 of us teach. We've learned that while these questions do exist for really all of us every day, that when you're in a time of transition, the heat's turned up. So these questions of identity, belonging, and purpose might be on a rolling boil for us, say, at our age. But when young people, permanent transition, they're like really steaming for young people. And so, I've started to look at myself and people in general, including young people, through this lens of identity, belonging, and purpose. If I'm feeling heat about an issue, emotional heat, it's normally because it's pricking at something in my sense of who I am, where I fit, and what difference can I make. For young people, just take my own kids. If they're doing something that seems a little odd, a little unlike them, a little askew from who they normally are, if I take a step back and go, okay, what question are they trying to answer? Identity, belonging, or purpose? All of a sudden it makes sense to me. I still might struggle with how to respond, but at least I understand and can empathize more with what they're seeking. So identity, belonging, and purpose, they're becoming the lens through which I view myself, my friends, my husband, really all people, and especially young people.
Those are extraordinarily helpful categories, because I'm looking again at my kids and the life stage, right? Because so many things are happening in the world right now. Coming out of a pandemic, coming out of BLM, coming out of all these things that have created a cultural tension and a kind of a crisis moment. And that's when, as you're pointing out, those questions get amplified. It becomes a place where their questions are being asked more sharply, more in depth. That's what I want to ask you, Steve, about how does that relate to spirituality for young people? Because those are great questions, but they can be absent of spirituality. How do we connect that kind of longing, that kind of questioning with one's spiritual life, one's kind of a Christian kind of longing or understanding?
Yeah, well, I think when we think about spirituality, questions of identity, belonging, and purpose are deeply rooted in our spirituality as well. They usually evoke some deeper questions. So when I'm asking the question, who am I? I'm also asking the question, well, who is God? So we can see that it moves quickly to there. Where do I fit or where do I belong begins to get to the question of, well, what's church about, or what's a faith community about? Where do I fit there? Or what purpose do I have? How do I fit in the world becomes a deeply important question of calling as well. So sometimes young people don't articulate it that way, like, I'm having this existential crisis, help me with theology. But these are deep theological questions that allow us to at least start at the felt need and recognize the fact that there's a deeper current that's sort of happening there. And, I think a lot of times when we think about evangelism or discipleship, we talk with a lot of adults that intend and have good intentions about wanting to connect with young people. They just don't know where to begin. And I think what's helpful with the questions of identity, belonging, and purpose, it kind of gives you a pretty safe starting point. And, I think what all adults and church leaders are looking for is just a little bit of traction with young people, right? The feeling that most adults have, or that feeling where a lot of adults, when you step into the youth room, nobody feels super comfortable stepping in there. You feel old, you feel outdated, you don't know that. I do. Right? And so if we can begin to kind of say, well, wait, we're all sort of asking these questions. We find a place of commonality. We find a place of interest. And I think that allows us to have the generative conversations that we believe young people actually want to have. Sometimes adults just have to go first in saying, hey, I'm willing to have those conversations with you, which I think is a risky move for us as adults as well.
I'm curious about this because, my son and I, my son is not a believer by his own admission. He says, I'm not. He's grown up in church all his life. But one of the conversations that we've had is exactly what both of you are describing. Is where's the connecting point for someone that's older, his parent, his father? Where's that connecting point? And oftentimes it's those three questions that become the connecting point. But it's also that kind of longing he has to explore those questions. So one of the connections for him and I is movies, and to say, okay, we're watching a movie, and how do we address these questions together? So what are some of those kind of connecting points that we can continue to have with young people? Because it sounds like what you're saying is your research and your work in this is showing they want to have these conversations. It's not something that they're kind of pushing aside, but what becomes the entry point for many of these conversations to occur.
Yeah, yeah. So many thoughts come to mind.
Yeah, yeah,
Sean.
right.
So first off, you make the point, and you made the point, Steve, that young people actually want to have these
Yes,
conversations.
yes.
And let me just like double click on that because that's really, really true.
Yeah.
Springtide Research Institute did some study of 13 to 25-year-olds in the U.S. during the pandemic. Here's the most disturbing stat I saw about young people and the church during the pandemic was this one, that only 10% of the few thousand 13 to 25-year-olds they surveyed heard from a faith leader during the first year of the pandemic.
Wow.
Wow is right. Like from any faith, not just Christianity, but any faith. That's the bad news, and I'm not sure if I'm more mad or sad about that. Like
Both.
yeah. But here's the good news, is that 70% of 13 to 25-year-olds are actually open to more meaningful relationships right now, with either peers or adults. So we feel like this is a divine window where young people who have been socially isolated, who are dealing with mental health challenges that are truly unprecedented for our young people in the U.S., where this is a wonderful window for us if we can be caring and empathetic, if we can find points of connection like you have with your son. And I love you leading into movies. It reminds me of a mom I met one time when I was speaking, and she came up to me afterwards and she said, my son, he doesn't want to talk to me about much. I asked him if he wants to go shopping. No. Want to go out to eat? No. But he loves movies. And so she said, I've become a student of film. I study directors, actors, genre, because that's the one thing he'll say yes to doing with me is going to movies. And she says, we have the best conversations usually on the drive home.
That's right.
And she's really wise because she said, I often pick movie theaters geographically further than needed.
That's good.
So I get a
Smart.
longer drive
very
on
good.
the way home. And, not that we want to spend all our time on movies, but what's interesting, being here in Los Angeles, we've talked with people in the entertainment industry about identity, belonging, and purpose. And they say, like, that's generally what separates a good script from a great script, is are we really exploring these themes of who am I, where do I fit, or what difference can I make? Which young people resonate with also. Like, so many young people, one of their top favorite shows is The Office.
Right.
Which is ironic because they've never worked in an office,
That's
right? But like my own kids love
Made
The Office.
decades ago.
Totally.
Yeah,
right.
We
ago.
quote
Yeah.
it, we quote The Office, we do Office trivia as a family, etc. But The Office brilliantly explores identity, belonging, and purpose, like in every episode. So just think about your favorite shows or movies. They're probably really saturated with that. And so, I think often media culture do give us this opportunity, like that song lyric, the Taylor Swift concerts that have been such a big deal. Like, what lyrics really stand out to you in Taylor's songs? And why do you think that is? And, my own kids have heard me talk about identity, belonging, and purpose. So it's a bit of a joke around our family. But if it wasn't for my kids hearing so much about our research, I don't think I'd ever talk with them about the terms identity, belonging, and purpose. It just more informs, okay, what are you seeing? What are you feeling? What are you looking for? And it's interesting because some of our colleagues in the School of Psychology, they have told us that they think with this actually across the board, belonging is the first among equals.
Right.
That all three shape each other. Belonging shapes identity and purpose in some unique ways. I think with this generation, purpose is giving belonging a run for its money.
Interesting.
And being primary, which connecting with evangelism, how do we create communities that just are saturated with belonging?
Yeah.
For young people who are feeling bullied, this is also the most ethnically and culturally diverse generation we've ever seen in the U.S. How do we create that kind of hub that's truly welcoming for people who look differently, who live differently, who act a little differently? And similarly, how can faith communities be greenhouses of purpose, where young people are using their gifts, are feeling like they are, shaping our world, and that intrigues them about Jesus. So, identity is also important, but when I think about evangelism specifically, I would say how do we create ministries and have one-on-one relationships where belonging and or purpose are just marinating in what we're describing and experiencing together.
I really like that idea about having these difficult conversations in the car.
Yeah.
Because you're both kind of looking forward. You don't have to do eye contact. So
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
not
right.
that awkwardness, but it also
Totally.
gives you the freedom. You're in a kind of an enclosed space. It's just the two of you. I really like that idea of having these kind of, I think that's where to have the sex talk with your kids, because
Yeah.
you don't have to make that awkward eye contact with your kids,
Right.
but you can talk about difficult situations and conversations.
Yeah.
And one of them I think you're alluding to, which I would love to hear both of your feedback on this. Coming out of the pandemic, I thought the COVID pandemic revealed another pandemic, which is the pandemic of mental health. And so when I'm thinking about mental health and how does that tie in with spirituality?
Yeah.
How does actually one's brokenness around identity
Yeah.
and mental health issue, one's a sense of a disconnect, how depression and anxiety is, I think, the pandemic of adolescence in this generation, and how all of that is a part of our cultural reality. But then how does the church, how does the gospel respond to that social reality?
Yeah.
Where is, as you were saying earlier, what does evangelism look like when this unique social cultural context is already in place, and we're learning more about it through our research? But how does the gospel respond to that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are great questions, and we're actually doing a seminar on mental health coming up really shortly. You can talk about that. You're going to be doing that. I think what Kara's been talking about, and I think what you're getting at as well, is I do think we have to be careful with identity, belonging, and purpose, that it doesn't turn into like this marketing campaign where we begin to figure out how do we like get kids back to church or in line or that type of thing. I think that underneath this is this element of curiosity, and I think this is part of evangelism as well. Where do we allow young people to be experts in their own lives? Their interest is one way. Being honest about how they're feeling with us is another way. I think that they are experts in their lives in tremendous ways, and unless we are willing to stop and in some ways be evangelized ourselves by their narratives, it's a one-way street that just feels like one more thing that they have to live up to or attain. And then this is where they feel like they're not perfect. This adds to mental health. In some ways, our best laid efforts can almost contribute to mental health because we lay one more expectation on them to be at youth group or to show up or to be a good Christian or not let Jesus down or let the church down or that type of thing. And so I think there's this curiosity and empathy that comes with that as well. And as adults, Kara and I talk about this a lot, we just have to remember that just because we were young people once doesn't mean we understand young people today.
True.
Right? Again, curiosity forces us to not say when I was your age, but to actually say, so tell me what your life is like now. Bring me into that and help me understand that. Secondly, and this comes not just from our research, but from research from Christian Smith and others, talking about spirituality is almost like a language. If we don't practice it, if we don't try and bump and fail like any language, we can't assume that we're going to have this moment in the car where all of a sudden we're going to have this beautiful conversation and it's all going to work. Actually, it's probably going to go quite badly, but we're trying.
Multiple times.
All the time, right? But that's the way a language begins to work, because then what happens is the spirituality isn't over here and everything else is over here, becomes intertwined with our lives. And I think that's really intriguing and compelling to any young person who, especially as they're getting older, and some of the work that I do with emerging adults, want to know that spirituality, faith, life, God can keep up with their increasingly complex worlds.
That's good. That's good.
We have a problem in youth ministry worlds where we blame earlier and earlier ministry expressions for the problems today. Well, it had to be the youth ministry. It had to be children's ministry, because this is idea that faith and spirituality is you somehow gas them up at 10, and that's going to carry them all the way till 30, which is not the way spirituality works, right? The tougher conversations you're having with your kids and we're having with ours require different language, different perspective, different openness to the fact that they are wrestling with deeper and more profound topics in their 20s than they did at 15. And so I was reflecting on this as thinking about this talk. Like, Jesus prays and teaches us to pray to give us today our daily bread. But it's not the same bread every day. I actually think there's like a spiritual meal plan, that there's consistency, but it's changing along the way because the questions are changing along the way. And I think that's part of the work that we have to do as we think about this as well.
So even as we're thinking about young people as teens and 20s, there's a pretty wide range in there as well, like what evangelism looks like, what discipleship looks like.
Absolutely.
And how one engages a 13-year-old versus a 29-year-old. Yet they still have kind of this kind of cultural dynamism that's similar in many ways, but unique in kind of specific ways as well. So Kara, tell us about how you would understand evangelism and how that term would apply given our unique context now.
Yeah. So, I think what's been interesting in U.S. youth ministry in the last few decades is I think we've understood more of what we don't want evangelism to be than what we do want it to be.
That's good.
We know it's not kind of the programmatic evangelism that was done in the 80s, 90s, and maybe early 2000s, but it needs to be something different. And this is where, I hate to sound like a broken record, but belonging and purpose, I think, do give some great lanes to drive through. And so for a youth ministry or for a small group or for an adult who wants to be that safe place for questions, for dialogue, how do I help young people engage in meaningful belonging, meaningful purpose? And how do I help young people, I don't think we've said this yet, understand that Jesus offers the best answers to those questions. That's what was so interesting as we spent time, especially with these 27 diverse young people, is hearing their current answers to these questions of identity, belonging, and purpose, and then using, what does this generation need to hear as Jesus's best answer? So, like just taking identity as an example, this generation, they constantly feel like they don't measure up. They constantly feel like they're not smart enough, they're not talented enough, they're not pretty enough, they're not popular enough. It's a different adjective, but I'm not blank enough.
And social media definitely
Elevates
elevates that.
Yeah, totally.
level.
I mean, it does for me.
Yeah.
At my age, like,
I'm on Facebook, they're on Twitter, and
their life looks so much better than mine right now. Like I have to be careful about when I check social media because everything looks so much better than what I'm doing at that moment. But so part of what we want to say as the Fuller Youth Institute when it comes to identity is how do we help young people know that Jesus makes them enough, that Jesus makes them more than enough, and that when they're feeling insecure, when they're feeling like they don't measure up, that in those moments of pain, in those moments of doubt, that's where Jesus is the Emmanuel who's with them. And, when you were talking about questions, Steve, one of the things that came to my mind that I think has been one of the surprises in the Fuller Youth Institute research in the last 15 years or so is the role of doubt in faith formation. We tend to think that doubt is toxic to faith. And, first of all, what we've seen in some of our surveys is that 70% of youth group kids admit to having significant doubts about faith. It's probably higher. And that could freak us out as adults. The good news is when those young people have a safe place to admit and explore those doubts, that's actually correlated with greater faith maturity.
Interesting.
So what we would say more simply is it's not doubt that is toxic to faith, it's silence that is toxic to faith. And I think that's true whether we're talking about somebody who's already in a relationship with Jesus or just curious about who Jesus is. So I think the way that we create a place of belonging where you can ask some of these big questions about suffering, about why the church in the U.S. is acting like it is these last 5 years.
These are important questions that are being raised by young people.
Totally. My own kids, they have real questions about how the church, as do I, in the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, I had one youth leader tell me his 13-year-old told him recently, why would I want to tell other people I'm a Christian? Christians are jerks. And sadly, that's a lot of what the media has portrayed and maybe reflects how we've been acting. So I think this is there's questions about the church. How do we help young people ask those questions? I mean, we could have a whole separate conversation about how do we help the church reclaim what it means to be a community of love and justice, because I think that's important for evangelism, for just the good of our country and our world. But let me just say that, I want, whether it's a dinner table, whether it's a Starbucks coffee house, whether it's a youth room, whether it's a Bible study at a house, whether it's in a car, wherever it is, like, can young people ask those questions? And one of the things that I think has helped me receive those questions is to have an answer to give when a young person stumps me. And note, I said when, not if, because I did the math. I've been to 26 grades of school. Soong-Chan, you maybe have been to more than that. I've been to 26 grades of school, but a 12-year-old can stump me with their questions about God and suffering. And so one of the things that we think is important is to have like a go-to response. And the one that we recommend to adults, parents, and leaders is, I don't know, but. Great question. I don't totally know why God would allow the suffering in the world that God's allowing. But how about we get together and have a next conversation? But here's what I have come to see about God in my own life. But why don't we invite somebody else at our church who I know thinks a lot about the role of suffering to a next conversation. So I don't know, but I've used that with my own kids when they've stumped me. So yes, this belonging, purpose, identity, can we also create tables, real or metaphorical, around which young people can raise those questions? And maybe, this will be the last thing I'll say, maybe part of that means we need to be willing to admit our questions as adults so that it's reciprocal. I mean, that's what you were talking about. Young people know when we're treating them like a project.
Absolutely.
I remember in college, we had an open-air evangelist come in, and he would stand in the middle of the quad, and people would come and ask him questions. And the usual question was, why does a good God allow suffering?
Totally.
Pretty common question, generationally. Everybody asks that question. His answer was, I do not know.
Yeah. And I know who you're talking about. And he would even do his fingers, right? Yeah, totally, totally.
But what I remember about that is that these were Ivy League students who had these questions.
Yeah.
If he had given them the straightforward, here are 6 passages that I've read that gives you the answer, I think half the crowd would have walked away.
Yeah.
But then it actually opened up a conversation. And the idea of, and I've been kind of thinking of this in evangelism, and is this really, in the terms of effectiveness for the next generation, the idea of truth possessed versus truth pursued. And that generationally, the boomers and the Gen Xers have operated under this truth possessed idea.
Yeah.
We own the truth. Our job in evangelism is just communicate the facts to the community so that they also can own the truth or accept the truth.
Yeah.
But I think Gen Y, Gen Z, just kind of generational, demographic changes, a lot of the changes that are occurring, what happened with COVID, what happened during that time, all of that is leading us, I think, more to this idea of truth pursuit, and exactly what you're describing. Let us seek the truth together. This one person doesn't have all the answers. We do not know, but let's actually see what the Bible might say, what movies might say, what these books might say. Let's actually pursue this together. What are some ways that, maybe this now shifts to how that works for the pastor who's listening in, the youth pastor who's listening in? What are some of the changes that we need to see in the churches and in the youth pastors and in the pastors to actually shift from these kind of different ways of thinking?
I think your truth pursued is the antidote to panic evangelism, right? Like this idea where we're like, we got to save them, we got to get them, we got to do all these things.
Our churches are in decline, people are leaving, and people are no longer being.
I mean, it's just bad theology, right? Like God loves the world. God is pursuing all of us. That we are caught up in this invitation of a redemptive story that God is inviting us into. And I think if we can trust the Spirit in these moments, perhaps there's ways that we can say that maybe young people aren't actually ready for the ultimate answer, that the process is actually them building the ability and the strength mentally, emotionally, relationally, to be able to hold ideas about spirituality or that type of thing. So I think that just maybe takes the pressure off a little bit. It doesn't take away the work, but I think it gives us hope that there's a patient process along the way. I know with my work with emerging adults, one of the things that I tell leaders all the time is the types of things that you want to talk about with young people, especially emerging adults, are not so much destination sort of topics or questions, but process questions. So where do you work or where do you live? Not good questions for emerging adults because they're holding 3 jobs and they're going to move 8.2 times between 22 and 32.
That's
right?
literal data.
Yeah, that's,
Yeah.
right. What's interesting is what if we were to say, what are you working on? Tell me what you're thinking about or what you're excited about. I think there are ways that process language invites and it sees process lives and it and acknowledges that along the way. For pastors, I think one of the things that I think a lot about as someone who has pastored and made this mistake is pedagogically, I think what happens is that we teach the way that we learn. It gets back to this idea of maybe I was evangelized in a certain way, so that's the way I think I need to do it. In many churches, probably not the ones that any of our listeners are listening to, sometimes the illustrations are always about a family whose parents are in their 40s. They have 2.3 kids, a dog, and a broken bike out front, and in the suburbs, right? What happens is our peripheral vision of the congregation gets narrower and narrower, and so the discipline that we have to have is broaden our perspective to actually say through our illustrations, I see you, and I see you, and I see you, and I see you, and inviting them into that conversation. And just this is about youth. Let's not always have the funny bad examples be about middle schoolers, right? Because what happens is, and our kids say this, is that congregational gathering is big church, which is their church, not my church. Right? So I think if we can find ways to be open and inviting, even in our language, nobody means anything badly by that. I think that that's one way to go. The second thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to Kara, is in some of the work that we're doing now with emerging adults, I think that we're coming to realize that a lot of leaders are getting really mad at emerging adults for not showing up where they expect them to show up.
Yeah.
And I think what we talk about at the Fuller Youth Institute is how do we show up in the places where young people say they need us the most? Okay. In the work that we've been doing, where you've been studying the transitions of emerging adults, where are these liminal spaces where the tools that got them here can't get them there? And it's probably the time that they're looking up for help. Perhaps that's the space that they're more open to the input of others. And congregations, what do they have? Wisdom, experience, social capital, power that they can use to serve those that are looking for help. And so what begins to happen is we begin to connect need with resource, and that begins to feel a bit like what the gospel's about. That's the good news that they're looking for. And that can then translate into beginning to see how faith integrates with my life and all that happens with that. So this is the work I think we're trying to figure out really quickly. Some of the data that we're getting back now, and we're just starting to process this, is we asked emerging adults, in your transition, we asked them to think about a particular transition. Was your faith community aware of what you were going through? And of those that said their faith community was aware, 90% said that they felt supported. So just being aware has an impact on the way young people are thinking about the church.
Thank you.
That's really good, Steve. So, Soong-Chan, I hear you very appropriately asking us to get more and more specific with what this actually looks like.
In a gentle, subtle way.
In a gentle, subtle, very delicate way.
Asian kind of subtlety coming in here. Yes.
So I'll be as pragmatic as I can in thinking about evangelism, especially with teenagers. And this is where, Steve and I think more about teenagers. Steve thinks more about emerging adults. So we kind of represent the 13 to 29 continuum overall. I would say the 2 ways that I'm seeing churches and faith communities make progress in evangelism. Number 1 is involving young people in service, involving young people in justice work, involving young people in actually making a difference in the community. There was a move, 10, 20 years ago in youth ministry when it came to short-term missions trips, for instance. Like, people needed to be Christians. Kids needed to be Christians before they went on those trips. And I probably said that aloud at some point and thought that was right. What we're seeing ministries do is remove that kind of requirement and say, hey, young people want to invite their friends to work at a senior adult center or to go on a weekend experience in inner city or wherever it might be. And so let's make that a front door.
That's good.
So, whatever your church is doing, whatever your young people already want to be involved in with service and justice, how can we make that a way that they feel like they can bring their friends? So I would say that's number one. Service and justice work is now a front door, not for mature kids, but it's actually an opening. The second thing I would say, and we've touched on this some, is give young people a place where they can ask questions. And Alpha has had a lot of success with structured questions with young people. Videos are on YouTube for free. There's a lot of churches, Catholic and Protestant, who are seeing great fruit come with that, whether it's something that structured or whether it's inviting young people ahead of time. Hey, what questions do you have? I love asking this question. If you could ask God any question, what would it be?
That's good.
And then seeing what young people say. They can do so anonymously. And then you do 2 or 3 weeks of welcoming young people, again, inviting them to invite their friends, which if they feel safe, if they trust you as a leader, they'll be a whole lot more likely to invite their friends. So notice in both these examples that I just gave that I'm assuming that young people are inviting friends. There are other models for evangelism, especially on the parachurch side. Young Life, Youth for Christ, FCA have a lot of success where it's more adult to young person on campuses, et cetera. And I think there's a lot the church can learn, and we are trying to learn from parachurch ministries right now. And I think for most churches, it's still going to be peer-to-peer. And so that young person has to feel okay bringing their friend. I mean, I remember being a 16-year-old feeling, and I was a committed youth group kid, and I felt like, okay, I wanted Krista to come to church, my friend Krista. And it took like 3-4 months for me to muster courage to invite her to come. And then the day that she came, the Wednesday night she came, was terrible. It was not my youth pastor, who I totally trusted, but he had a guest come who he had never met, and it was like this bizarre political talk. Like it was terrible. It was terrible, and I was just like so embarrassed. And so my youth ministry kind of let me down, honestly, at that moment. So, but I did trust my youth pastor enough to eventually invite Krista to come. And so I think, young people need to trust that we're creating that safe space that they can invite a friend for questions, for service, or for something else.
Yeah. I appreciate the way the research is being integrated into theological reflection and then kind of incorporated into application. And that's the good work of FYI and folks at Fuller. I want to stretch a little bit here. And it's not in the notes. It's not anywhere I've asked before. You can anticipate this, though. So this is a missiology conference. And so we're going to have a much broader audience, probably global and international in nature. How does this work cross-culturally? How does this work outside of the U.S. context? And recognizing that a lot of your research has been in North America based, and appropriately so, because this is the audience that you're trying to reach and minister to. But what are some of the lessons you've learned that can translate, one, because we're living in such a diverse community now, so how does that work across the cultures, across the generations? I'm thinking, what does a recent Korean immigrant youth kid have in terms of reach versus someone who was born in the U.S. Outside of the U.S.? What are we looking at in different cultural contexts that's maybe less developed in terms of church structures? And so generally speaking, how does this move outside of the U.S. context and maybe in a cross-cultural setting?
Wow, thanks a lot.
Well, you knew that was coming. Come on.
No, really, really great. I think what we know, not just from our research, but beyond, we know that in some ways, young people are saying that they feel like they have more in common with kids in their generation in other countries compared to the generational connection. And so I do think there's some overlaps. I don't think that means we're exporting Western ideas around the world, but I do think the technology has sort of flipped the switch a little bit as to the ways young people see and identify and think about culture, which I think is really, really powerful. I do think young people are much more aware of justice issues. I don't think they let us leaders get away with particular assumptions. we have to be more attentive and particular to young people's heritage and where they come from, and think about those things and honor the stories of their ancestors that have brought them to where they have come. And I think that that's been really, really crucial. I also think that a lot of times in the work that we're doing, and others as well, is I think sometimes we think that young people are just free agents making choices about their faith or spirituality, but previous generations have handed them something spiritually, economically, culturally as well. And so I think a lot of our work tries to appreciate the world that's been handed to them and the choices that they're trying to make within that. Sometimes they're living quite faithfully, but just in a different sort of a way, simply because of what's been passed along to them. So I think that I think is fairly crucial. I do think, not to bring it back to identity, belonging, and purpose, but I do think there are still some foundational human things that are expressed in different sort of ways that bring us back to our humanity, and I think that is really, really important. I think generationally, Kara and I are pretty careful with this. The generational wars and divisions that especially pop up, I would say, in the U.S., but I think culturally that becomes a really important issue as we think about first gen, second gen, and all those type of things. There is a difference between generations, and oftentimes this turns into sort of a pithy, okay, boomer, or that type of thing. But I actually think the world, we know sociologically and philosophically, is speeding up. So the overlap of shared experiences between generations is less and less, which doesn't mean we give up on each other. It just means we have to lean in a little bit more, believing that intergenerational matters, believing that the voices of the elders can still speak to the younger ones, and vice versa. And how do we think about that? And again, bringing this back to evangelism, I just wonder if, like, internationally, there's a body that is committed to intergenerational relationships, that actually cares about one another and all that. That's kind of the church, right?
It sounds like the church.
I know,
Steve.
right?
Supposed to
So,
be.
right. So, I think sometimes I wish the church would embrace its intergenerationalness. And its willingness to live in unity and diversity, and I think it can be a light and good news to the world if we want it to be. And I hope that we can learn from our brothers and sisters around the world that oftentimes do that so much better than Western culture, who's very individualized and almost celebrates disconnecting from our elders rather than finding those connections along the way. So I think we just have a lot to learn from each other. And again, the global church is interconnected. I feel like if there's an institution that can learn from each other, we can as well. And all for the purpose of advocating for young people, right? Next generation. We want to pass along the faith, but we want to do that in a way that's faithful and honoring to them, and maybe give them give the next generation something that they can really work with, rather than trying to have to, like we do. And I guess it's always a little bit of both, right?
That's right. Good.
Great answer, Steve, and great question, Soong-Chan. You touched on, Steve, that something that came to mind is, as I was thinking, okay, because you're right, most of our research is focused on U.S., North American young people, very diverse young people.
Right.
Well, I mean, the U.S., the good news is in the U.S., we crossed a line in 2020 where now half of those under 18 are young people of color, which we celebrate that diversity. So that's certainly reflected in our research. But I was trying to think, what that we've been talking about in the last 30 minutes or so would feel white, Western, et cetera. And I think we probably have had a little bit more of an individual perspective versus a communal perspective. We probably haven't talked enough about family and the role of parents and extended family members in a young person's journey, in relationships that are even possible for the young person to have or not have. So, we have tested identity, belonging, and purpose quite a bit here in the U.S. in very diverse contexts, and the categories have remained salient. And I think, outside of the U.S., there would need to be some modifications, more communal, even more communal, as well as really mindful of family dynamics and family values, which tend to influence a young person more than in many U.S. contexts. So
that's great insight. So, for example, identity in a U.S. kind of a nuclear family model.
Yeah.
And how that differs from a non-Western, more kind of kinship,
Totally.
tribal,
Yes.
much
Totally.
more extended family model.
Multi-generational.
Yeah, and how
yes,
identity
yes.
differs
Right.
there, but the theme of
Yes.
identity still remains the
Yes,
same. Yes,
yes.
the impact of identity.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Great answers and great thoughts on this. Let's close with something hopeful, and that is, what are you hopeful about? What gives you energy and joy about what's up ahead, and what are you hopeful about in evangelism with young adults?
So I'll go back to the 13-year-old I talked about who told her dad, "Why would I tell others I'm a Christian? Christians are jerks." And I didn't get a chance to talk to her. But if I had gotten to talk to her, I would have told her what I've told my own kids, which is, we need you to figure out new ways of being the church, new ways to model who Jesus is in culture today in ways that are biblically grounded, very relevant to today's issues. And I have way more confidence in, well, 13's a little young, but I have way more confidence in 16 and 26-year-olds figuring that out and embodying that than I do 46, 56, and 66-year-olds. So I think this generation has and is and will help us figure out how to be the church, and be the church that is welcoming to people who don't have a relationship with Jesus yet, as well as those who already have a relationship with Jesus. So I'm putting my time, money, and effort in the young people.
Amen.
That's why I love working with you. That was so great.
Thank you.
I don't know if I can even add to that, but I think that maybe
Sure
one of the
you can.
ways I could think about it is, I think too often as we think about young people, we get stuck on one narrative.
Yeah.
It's good.
And it's usually a negative narrative.
Yeah.
They're leaving church, they don't care about God, that type of thing. We're not Pollyannish enough to not say that that's not true in some ways, but there are actually multiple narratives, and there are beautiful stories of young people doing remarkable things
Yes.
that are living out the gospel in profound ways and bringing hope and light and life to this world. And so I think one of the things that we have to do as leaders is just always be looking for the multiple stories, because the multiple stories will shape the way we react and respond to young people. If the narrative is only one, and if it's only negative, we will react in a certain way. And so one of the challenges I think we think about a lot with our research and otherwise is looking for those multiple stories, because if we can tell a better story of what young people are doing, I think we can have better conversations and more generative ministry opportunities and more hope. And we are committed to that. We're not messing around, right?
Amen. Amen. How can folks who want to know more about the work of Fuller Youth Institute and 10 by 10 in particular,
Yeah.
the new project that's launching very soon, actually, as we
Yes,
speak,
it will
is
have
launching
launched
this-
by the
it
time
is
Yes.
this
launched.
show.
Yeah.
How can folks connect with the work, that work?
Yeah, so fulleryouthinstitute.org, you can sign up to get regular emails that come and talk about evangelism, discipleship, identity, belonging, and purpose, all free. And then you're right, we are particularly excited about 10 by 10, which has been building for 4 or 5 years. It's over 60 denominations and organizations who are saying, given the pain and potential of young people, we want to work together to disciple, which includes evangelism. We have said
Yes.
that very clearly,
Excellent.
like they go hand in hand. But we want to deepen the faith of 10 million teenagers in the next 10 years in the spirit of John 10:10, where Jesus talks about the abundant life. And so we also have all sorts of free resources available at 10by10.org, which is TENX10.org. So TENX10.org.
Fantastic. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Kara.
Thanks, Sujang.
I'm going to channel my inner televangelist and close us out in prayer.
Perfect.
Absolutely.
Gracious God, thank you for the good work of FYI, 10 by 10, and especially the good work of Steve and Kara, but also the many, many faithful pastors and youth workers, but especially the young people who seek after you. Thank you for the ways they are in our lives and the ways that you've called us to love them with the love of Christ. May your word go forth, and may your truth and may your love and your grace go forth. And we ask that you would do this in your name and in your authority, in which we pray. Amen.